Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Odyssey Recaps Below the Surface Edition. Today we are recapping Chapter 13, titled by Emily Wilson as Two Tricksters. The last chapter ended fairly abruptly after Odysseus described the devastating loss of his men and his harrowing escape from the wrath of the gods and the dread monsters Scylla and Charybdis. This chapter opens on the listening Phaeacians as they sit spellbound, listening to his tale. King Alcinous is the first to speak, telling Odysseus that his years of wandering are over, that he has endured enough, and they're going to help him get home. The king also promises to give Odysseus rich gifts and treasures, so that he might return with the wealth he was promised after sacking Troy, which of course he's lost with his men in his travels. The king reassures the listening nobles that he will tax the people of Phaeacia so that the noblemen don't have to suffer from their unrewarded generosity. The nobles are pleased, of course, and everyone goes home to rest. The next day, they gather, and after preparing the ship, the king sacrifices a cow to Zeus, and they dedicate burnt offerings to the gods and feast. Odysseus is impatient to leave and keeps his eye on the sun, waiting for sunset when they can at last set off. For modern readers, this detail of waiting until nighttime to sail may seem insignificant, but for ancient listeners to this mythical tale, this is another reminder of the magical power of the Phaeacians and their ships. The Mediterranean Sea was a treacherous place at night, with many small islands, shallows, and rocks that a ship could easily wreck on. Without radar or sonar, detecting these threats rested entirely on the eyesight of the crew. To a listening ancient Greek audience, a ship that could sail swiftly and safely at night would have seemed fantastically magical. Finally, night arrives, and Odysseus tells the king that he is grateful to him and all the Phaeacians for their help and prays that the gods bless them and their families, but that it's time for him to go. The Phaeacians agree and perform one final offering of libations to all the gods, and then Odysseus is loaded onto the ship with all his treasures, and he offers the Phaeacians and their king and queen one final blessing, and then they set off, finally, towards Ithaca. Odysseus lies down on the stern deck of the ship and falls asleep, listening to the rhythmic sound of the oars splashing into the water, each splash pulling him towards home. The poem describes the ship flying faster than the swiftest hawk, slicing smoothly through the waves, as she bore a man whose mind was like the gods, who had endured many heartbreaking losses and the pain of war and shipwreck. Now he slept in peace, and he remembered nothing of his pain. Just before dawn, the ship finally arrives at Ithaca. Following the advice Agamemnon gave to Odysseus in the underworld, they pull into a secluded harbor, a sacred place, out of sight of any watching eyes. They unload Odysseus, still fast asleep, and rest him on the sand. Not wishing to wake him, they unpack all the treasures the Phaeacians gave him and heap them underneath an olive tree, a tree sacred to Athena, in the hopes that if anyone does happen to pass by, they won't steal the treasures or harm Odysseus, as it could incur the wrath of Athena. The Phaeacians leave, headed back home to Phaeacia, but unfortunately, the holy wrath that follows Odysseus has now attached itself to them. The poem reads, Poseidon, lord of earthquakes, still remembered his hatred of Zeus, his hatred of Odysseus. And then he turns to Zeus and he says, "O Father Zeus, I will lose all my standing with the gods, since mortals fail to honor me, though these Phaeacians are my very own descendants." He then says that he wouldn't have kept Odysseus from home forever, as it was Zeus's will that he eventually return to Ithaca, but that the Phaeacians have spirited Odysseus home far too easily and with far too many gifts. Poseidon says that he now has more treasure than he ever would have won at Troy. Poseidon doesn't want the gods to think the Phaeacians are allowed to cheat him out of forcing Odysseus to endure the maximum amount of suffering before he's allowed to return home. Zeus responds that Poseidon would never lose his standing with the gods, but that if he wants to punish the Phaeacians for disrespecting him and his plans for Odysseus, then he may punish them as he sees fit. Poseidon replies, "Lord of dark clouds, I have always wanted to. I held back out of deference to you. But now, when that fine ship of those Phaeacians comes back from helping him across, I want to smash it in the sea and overwhelm their city with a mountain to prevent them from ever guiding travelers again." Poseidon's eagerness to punish his own descendants, and punish them so brutally for such a seemingly small act of kindness, presents an interesting perspective on the relationship between gods and mortals. The Phaeacians are essentially trapped between two gods here. Odysseus had told them that he was being punished by Poseidon for blinding his son Polyphemus, but he was also a visiting stranger, and they are bound to help visiting strangers by Zeus. Perhaps they thought that Poseidon was done punishing him, that he had already endured the required amount of pain. But even if they did think that perhaps Poseidon wanted to punish him further, were they supposed to risk angering Zeus, the king of the gods, protector of travelers and strangers, by not offering to help and share hospitality with this stranger? And let's not forget the role that Athena played in ensuring that Odysseus looked and sounded almost godlike himself. I find this type of no-win scenario and the ease with which the gods turn on otherwise very loyal and faithful mortals over petty grievances endlessly fascinating. The gods of Greek mythology aren't infallible lawmakers or ever just guardrails for the immorality and injustice of man. Instead, they're petty and unfair, and even if you perform all the correct sacrifices and libations, you might still incur their wrath. This might seem like a strange basis for a religion, but in a way it reflects the unfairness of life. Someone might live a kind and moral life and still face ruin or sorrow or death. A bad end can't always be avoided, no matter how well you live or how hard you try. And I think there's something oddly comforting in a belief system that allows for such an honest reflection of the uncertainty of mortal life. It reminds me of a quote from Star Trek. It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness, that is life. Anyway, back to the story. Zeus, far from trying to defend the Phaeacians, suggests that Poseidon waits until the ship is nearly home and turns it into stone while the city watches to maximize the horror for them. Then he suggests Poseidon surround their island with a huge mountain, cutting them off from the rest of the world. Poseidon thinks this sounds great, so he goes to Phaeacia and waits until the boat pulls into view. Then, when it's in full view of those watching from the shore, he slaps it, causing it to instantly turn to stone and anchor itself in the seabed. The watching Phaeacians are horrified and question who could have done this terrible thing. King Alcinous addresses the crowd, telling them that long ago his own father had predicted that one day Poseidon, who apparently hates the Phaeacian habit of helping travelers return home, would punish them for helping a stranger, and Poseidon would destroy a ship on her home journey and then hide their city with a mountain. He tells the Phaeacians that they must stop helping visitors travel and also immediately go and sacrifice 12 bulls to Poseidon in the hopes that he may show mercy and not enfold our city in a mountain. And that's where we leave the Phaeacians, gathered around an altar, hoping their sacrifice will save them. Meanwhile, Odysseus wakes up on the beach in Ithaca, but Athena has cast a magical mist so that he won't recognize his homeland. She has a plan she needs him to listen to. She wants to transform him into an unrecognizable figure to help him infiltrate his home and take revenge on the suitors. I'd like to note that the poem specifically says that she wants him to pay the suitors back for how they misbehaved. Simply expelling the suitors is not enough for Odysseus to reclaim his role as king and head of his household. Honor demands vengeance, and as in so many other works of ancient Greek literature and mythology, such a debt is best paid in blood. Odysseus is devastated to find himself once again stranded on a seemingly unrecognizable beach. He groans and sobs and asks, "Where am I now? Are those who live here violent and cruel, or are they kind to strangers, folks who fear the gods?" An interesting question and not easily answered. What does Odysseus, a man who by his own admission has slaughtered cities, conquered nations, and enslaved women and children, see as violent and cruel? He himself has certainly fit that description at times. One could argue that there is a difference between warfare and how a nation treats strangers, but we've just seen the consequences of kindness and hospitality to strangers in the brutal punishment of the Phaeacians. What constitutes violence and cruelty, and where does Ithaca fall on such a scale? Are the Ithacans violent and cruel? I'd like you to keep this in mind as we enter the endgame of the Odyssey. But back to the beach. Odysseus is at a loss, wondering where he can hide his treasure so it's not stolen. He curses the Phaeacians, who he now thinks are untrustworthy and have broken their promises and abandoned him on yet another island. He calls on Zeus who protects strangers to punish these sinners for their transgressions before deciding to count his treasure in case they've stolen any. Of course, he only has treasure to count thanks to the generosity of the Phaeacians, and Zeus has already punished them, though of course not for failing to protect and aid a stranger, but instead for adhering to Zeus's laws, really underscoring the damned if you do, damned if you don't fate of the Phaeacians. Odysseus counts his treasure, and once he has been assured that nothing was stolen, he huddles on the shore, hunched over and sobbing with grief and homesickness. Athena comes walking down the beach towards him. this time disguised as a young shepherd holding a javelin. Odysseus is overjoyed to see someone and greets her, asking the stranger to please be kind and help protect him and his treasure. He offers to pray and supplicate to her as a god and asks, where is he? What land is he washed up on, and who lives in such a place? Athena replies, saying, stranger, you must be a foreigner from distant parts, or foolish, since you ask about this famous country. Many people know it, from those who live towards the east under the rising sun to those out west in lands of gloomy dusk. This is rough country, not fit for grazing horses, and not spacious, but not infertile. Grain and wine abound here. The land is always wet with rain and dew. There are fine water holes, and it is good for raising goats and cattle, and the trees are varied. Foreigner, I think the name of Ithaca is even known in Troy, a land they say is far away from Greece. You may ask why Athena would do this. Why make him think that he is yet again washed up on a foreign shore? Why disguise his home into something strange and unrecognizable? It could be that Athena is trying to remind Odysseus that the Ithaca he has returned to is not the Ithaca he left so long ago. 20-odd years is a long time, and his young bride, infant son, and home have all fundamentally changed. In many ways, Odysseus is indeed a stranger and a foreigner in this Ithaca. Then there's a description of the land itself. A rough country. Small, always wet with rain, watering holes, good for raising goats and cattle. Note that these descriptors are in many ways opposite to the ways in which magical paradises that Odysseus chose to leave were described. Ithaca is rough country, not lush or as fertile as the islands of Circe, Calypso, the Cyclops, or the Phaeacians. Ithaca has fine water holes, but not the magically convenient clear running streams of the other islands. They can raise goats and cattle, but no mention of the sheep that are frequently eaten at festivals and sacrifices in other places. Then there's the rain. One of the most common descriptors for lands inhabited by gods is that they exist in perfect conditions with no rain or cold. By saying that Ithaca is always wet with rain and dew, a sharp distinction is drawn between this place and paradise. And yet, there's pride in the description of this rough land. They may not have magical trees and fields that produce crops year-round with little effort, but they can grow grain and grapes for wine. They can raise their goats and cattle for feast and sacrifice. This island may not be spacious or magical, but with hard work, it is enough, and there's a special kind of magic to that. Odysseus, on hearing that he is finally home, is overjoyed, but suspicious. Ever scheming, he decides to lie to this stranger. Now, I'd like to take a quick step back here to talk about this lie and what it kicks off in terms of the story structure. This is the first of a series of lies told by Odysseus in this last section of the story. Scholars often refer to these lies collectively as the Cretan lie. The lies are detailed, specific, and extremely odd. They get repeated with some variation several times to different listeners, but Odysseus' disguised persona comes from Crete is a central theme. One scholar named Steve Reese proposes that these lies seem so out of place in the narrative are actually remnants from a different version of the story, in which Odysseus really does go to Crete, once again in disguise, and there meets Telemachus. If anyone's interested in hearing more about this and Reese's argument, just let me know in the comments. The lies do still make sense within the context of the story as we have it now, but they do stand out as being strangely detailed in ways that really don't seem to lead to anything much. So if you start getting lost, don't worry. It's not you. Scholars have been arguing about this for centuries, and we need to keep in mind that this story was handed down through generations and cultures and societies in patchwork before it ever came to us, and we may be missing important context. But on to the lie. Odysseus tells Athena that he is in exile from Crete, that the treasure he has here is only half his wealth, that he left the other half in Crete for his children. He was exiled for murdering the son of the king of Crete, a king he had refused to serve or help in the Trojan War. He had insisted on leading his own men, but the prince wanted to steal his hard-won spoils, so Odysseus had laid in wait to ambush the prince. He says, "The sky was dark that night, and no one saw me kill him with my sharp sword of bronze. And after I murdered him, I quickly rode away." Hiding in wait with a sword to murder unsuspecting royalty is eerily similar to both his time hiding in the wooden horse at Troy, but also to the suitors lying in wait to murder Telemachus. Once again, the lines between murderer and victor are blurred. Odysseus carries on, telling the disguised Athena that he then rode to a different land and gave the people a share of the loot to take him even further away, but the ship transporting him to a new life was blown off course by a storm. They arrived at this shore under the cover of night, and exhausted, they all fell asleep right there on the beach. The others awoke before Odysseus and set his treasure next to him before setting off again. Athena is thrilled with Odysseus' attempt at deception. She takes his hands and transforms herself into a beautiful woman and praises his expert lying, saying that even a god would need to be an expert at deceit to outwit him. She says, "You clever rascal, so duplicitous, so talented at lying. You love fiction and tricks so deeply, you refuse to stop, even in your own land." She compares him to herself, saying they are both smart, both experts at craftiness. She tells him that she is Athena, child of Zeus, and that she is always near him, watching over him and helping him through his hardships. She made sure the Phaeacians helped him and gave him treasure, and that now she will help him with the challenges he faces at home. She tells him, "This is your fate, and you must bear it bravely, not telling any man or woman that you have finished wandering and come back. Suffer in silence, bear their brutal treatment." Odysseus is not convinced, and warily tells her that even the smartest man would have trouble recognizing her, that she disguises herself in so many ways. He knows she helped him at Troy, but where has she been since? Why didn't she help him in all those years he spent lost and wandering? He says he thinks she must still be tricking him, and asks her to tell him truthfully if this land that he doesn't recognize is really his beloved Ithaca. She replies that his keen intelligence is why she cannot ever abandon him, that a normal man would have immediately rushed home to see his wife and child, but Odysseus hasn't even asked about them until he has tested Penelope, who Athena says is sitting at home spending her days in tears and her nights in misery. Athena says she knew all along he would eventually get home, but that she couldn't go against her father or uncle's wishes to delay him. She makes the mist disperse and reveals the familiar landmarks. The poem reads, "Odysseus, after so long a wait and so much pain, was filled with happiness at last." Finally convinced, Odysseus kisses the earth in joy and lifts his arm in prayer to the nymphs who inhabit a cave on this section of the beach, saying that if his commander, Athena, allows him to live and raise his son, he will offer them gifts. Athena tells him he doesn't need to worry, but that he must be brave and they must hurry and hide his treasure safely in the caves. Then they can plan how best to destroy the suitors. When the treasure is hidden and they are ready to plot, Athena says, "Great king, Laertes' son, master of plots and plans, Odysseus, think how to strike the suitors. For 3 years they've been lording in your house and courting your godlike wife with gifts. She always longs for your return and grieves. She leads them on with promises and messages to each, but her mind moves elsewhere." This is a stunningly complimentary way for a goddess to speak of mortals. Athena, god of craftiness, calls Odysseus a master of plots and plans. She, a goddess, calls Penelope godlike, and praises her ability to hold off the suitors. While other mortals have been praised or loved by the gods, this still stands out as one of the most interesting relationships between god and mortal, and a far more collaborative one than I've seen before. Odysseus thanks her and says that if not for her intervention, he would have died like Agamemnon at the hands of the suitors. But now she has warned him, and they can form a plan of attack. He asks her to stand by me, give me courage and drive to fight as when I broke the shining crown of Troy. If you will join me with that zeal and help me, goddess queen, I can do battle against 300 men at once. Athena tells Odysseus that she will always be with him, and that together they will make sure the suitors will splatter your broad floors with blood and brains. She goes on to disguise him as an old beggar, so he can return home unrecognized and infiltrate his home. A tactic Odysseus is familiar with. You'll remember in Book 4 when Helen told Telemachus that Odysseus disguised himself as an old beggar to infiltrate the streets of Troy and gather information. Athena goes on and tells Odysseus to first visit the swineherd, a slave who adores Penelope, Telemachus, and Odysseus. Meanwhile, she will go to Sparta, where Telemachus is trying to find out if his father is alive and tell him it's time to return home. Odysseus is upset and asks why she didn't tell Telemachus that he was alive already. Why did she let him suffer, lost at sea like he was, while the suitors devoured his inheritance? Athena tells him not to worry, that Telemachus isn't suffering, and that she guided him herself so that he, like his father, might win glory in his travels. The suitors do wish to kill him, she says, but she thinks they won't succeed, and instead will be covered by the earth once Odysseus is done reclaiming his home. Athena then taps Odysseus with her wand, and he is instantly transformed into an old and ragged beggar, covered in rags and dirty with soot. She gives him a threadbare satchel and walking stick to complete the look, and with plans set, they part. Her setting off to retrieve Telemachus, and him, at long last, towards home. And that's where our chapter ends. But before we go, I just want to talk about one more thing. We just saw Odysseus finally arrive home on the shores of Ithaca. He has spent 20 years away, and though we can't know his feelings for the whole time he was away, we do know that he's been trying to get home for at least 10. And the last few years have been spent weeping on a beach, just longing to be home. Odysseus turned down paradise 3 times, with Circe, then Calypso, and then the Phaeacians, to return to this wet, rough country. And yet, his homecoming is surprisingly underwhelming and muted. He doesn't know where he is at first. And then, even after a disguised Athena tells him it's Ithaca, he must hide his joy as he quickly works out a lie to tell the stranger. This moment that Odysseus has been yearning and striving for is buried under more plots and schemes and false identities. In her introduction, Emily Wilson talks about how it's difficult to really tell when Odysseus finally, truly arrives home. There seem to be a series of perfunctory homecomings that are overshadowed by the looming threats of the suitors and their families. This is something I'll talk about more as the story unfolds, but for now it's interesting to consider how homecoming can mean different things, and how although Odysseus has finally arrived on the shores he so desperately longed for, he's not yet home, and there's still a long journey ahead of him. But more on all that later. Join us next time to find out what happens next as we recap chapter 14. I'll see you guys there.